Well, we have big news. It turns out that many international organizations are effectively treating California as a separate nation. Big breaking news this week. We'll be covering that in just a second. The continuing story of how places around the world already view California as a separate nation from America. It's just in America. They're not quite sure about that idea. We'll be right back and show you the details. Well, let me go right to it. So recently, the World Economic Forum and the European Union have begun to act as though California was a separate nation. The European Union is the collection of governments that forms the European continent, one of the largest collective governments out there with a economic GDP larger than America's, if I'm not mistaken. Secondly, the World Economic Forum is one of the top policy discussion forums in the planet. And they just said, well, it's kind of like California is a separate country. So you have one of the top world economic discussion forums, top policy thinkers in the planet saying California looks like a country this week. And then you also have the EU saying we should start treating California like a country. So you have one of the largest continents on earth saying we should treat California as a country. And you have one of the top global discussions organizations anywhere in the world saying California is kind of like a country. So the conclusion is the WEF, the EU, and we'll show you how previously the UN basically recognized California as a separate country already, continuing the process of formal recognition for California's secession. Well, let me show you exactly what we're talking to. Get right to it. So this is from the eeas.europa.eu. It's European news. U.S. Digital. EU opens new office in San Francisco to reinforce digital diplomacy. So the EU, European Union, is opening an office here in California, specifically for digital diplomacy. And we'll work to improve participation of stakeholders and business people and policymakers and civil society. Let's see. The office will work under the authority of the EU delegation in Washington, D.C., in close coordination with headquarters in Brussels and in partnership with EU member states in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there's an EU office in Washington, D.C., they're going to create a separate EU office here in California on the other side of the continent that's focused on digital diplomacy. So there's only one EU office, to the best of my knowledge, and that's in DC. They're going to open a second EU office right here in California so that the European Union can be directly connected to California and the tech economy. So this is basically like opening an embassy. In fact, that's what the World Economic Forum said. Why is the European Union opening a Silicon Valley embassy? So the World Economic Forum top-level discussion is viewing the EU as opening an embassy, what you would do with a foreign country, in California. That just happened. The European Union is opening a new office in California, Silicon Valley, giving European regulators direct access to major digital technology companies and vice versa. So the WEF is calling it an embassy, and the EU is opening an embassy in California. Well, you shouldn't be too surprised. This happened recently, but a little while back, let's see if we need a date on this. Sorry. Okay. No date. Well, sorry, this happened recently. January 9th, 2020. So last year, the EU Parliament debates, could California be considered adequate on its own? Could California have its own privacy shield arrangements separate from the rest of the United States? Could California have its own privacy shield arrangements separate from the United States? That's what the Parliament Committee of Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs discussed in depth at the European Commission's report. So last year, the European Union was saying, maybe California could have a totally separate privacy online policy, completely independent from America's. So we'll have one policy for America and we'll have one policy for California. That's what the European Union said. Then this year they said, hey, let's open up a full-on embassy. So last year it was, should we treat California separate from the rest of America? This year it's, let's open an embassy. Also, you shouldn't be surprised. Tony Blair, Prime Minister of England, met Arnold Schwarzenegger to talk about climate change, and he specifically did not meet with American President George W. Bush. So Tony Blair, leader of England, came out here, met with the governor of California, and dissed the American president, didn't meet with him at all, just met with the California governor, and then flew back to England. That happened around 2007, 2005. Not to be outdone, Francois Hollande also visited Silicon Valley and gave a speech. So the Prime Minister of France came to Silicon Valley recently, I think in 2014 maybe, to talk. And then Tony Blair also worked with California and snubbed America. And then you can see the European Union is talking about separate policies for California from America just last year, January 9th. And then now they're into, let's have a separate embassy for California alone, separate from America, and the WEF is confirming. Now, the World Economic Forum has routinely talked about California as a separate country. This is the top economic discussion forum on the planet. Which American state has a bigger economy than the separate country of India? World Economic Forum asked in 2016. California. By the way, July 2016 was right before the election. California has the world's fifth largest economy. That's what the World Economic Forum said in 2018. And then in 2018, they literally said California is almost becoming a different country. January 8th, 2018, World Economic Forum, California, a separate country. World Economic Forum. But I also wanted to point out that the United Nations itself also kind of recognized California. So go back to 2009. Governor Schwarzenegger and the United Nations opened Governor's Global Climate Summit. 2009 by Cindy Holden, California Newswire. And here you go. After last year's successful Governor's Global Climate Summit, the United Nations asked California to host another summit focused on the great work of city, states, and regions who are already ahead of the federal governments in developing solutions to climate change. So the UN said, hey, we can't get major governments to move on climate change. California, why don't you keep having the global climate discussion for us? We're the United Nations. We're the place that should have these global discussion forums. We completely failed at it. You did very well the year before. So why don't you do our job for us, is what the UN said to California, and you have the global climate discussion. So the UN handed it off to California, a state of America, not America, California, and said, why don't you do our job as the global discussion forum for us? That's what the UN said. Then that same year that the UN did that, in 2009, recognized California and said you should have a separate California UN conference. Current Governor Gavin Newsom proposed a UN headquarters at Hunters Point in 2009. Now, here's the thing. The UN spoke positively about the suggestion of a new UN center at Hunters Point in San Francisco in 2009. So the UN in 2009 said, hey, California, have the global discussion on climate change for us, although it's our job. That same year, they said, hey, California, are you looking at proposing a UN center? Well, we, the UN, think that's a great idea. Happened in 2009. I want to point out, it kind of makes sense because the UN is the world's first discussion forum, way before the WEF. And way before Davos. And you know what? California was the site of the first UN. So the very first World Discussion Forum conference that really worked as in the modern era as we know it was in California. And where did the world want the UN to be? In California. In fact, the UN is only in America because Americans overruled international opinion and moved the UN from San Francisco to DC. So the first UN was in California. The world wanted the UN in California. The world was overruled by America, and the UN was moved to DC or New York. So I just showed you how the European Union has basically recognized California as an independent country going back 10 to 15 years. Now they're opening an embassy. The year before that, they said, let's have separate policies for California from America. Then you had the World Economic Forum say, that's basically the European Union opening an embassy. Then I showed you for the last 10 years how the World Economic Forum basically recognizes California as a separate country already. Then I showed you that the EU, a giant discussion forum of countries, the WEF, a giant discussion forum of countries, is not alone because the United Nations itself, another giant discussion forum of countries, basically said California should have the global discussion on climate change, and basically said it would be cool if a new UN office to hold that discussion was focused in California. And that kind of makes sense because the world originally wanted the UN in California. And that also makes sense because France basically treated California as a separate country during the Paris Climate Accord. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. Okay, well, I can't find it. I'll have to dig through it. But Paris Climate Accord, California went. France treated California like a separate country from America around 2015 at the Paris Climate Accord. That was when Obama was president. Obama was president, and France still treated California separate from America. So the European Union seems to recognize that California is a separate country. They want to recognize it as such. The World Economic Forum sees the European Union do that. The World Economic Forum, one of the top discussions, already sees California as a separate country. The UN basically said California was doing its job and basically signed off on a new UN office. And that makes sense because the UN was originally supposed to be here. So just wanted to show you that California is essentially already a de facto separate nation when you look at international conglomerations of nations that decide basically the world economy and the direction of the planet. The World Economic Forum, the European Union, and the United Nations itself are just a few examples of how people at a super scholarly level already get that California is a separate country. Totally agree with you, James. Totally agree. It was a quick show. That was it. Just wanted to get those facts out. We'll be back soon with another show. Jason Wright will be back, and we're going to be covering how professors were wrong when they said that CalExit couldn't happen. We'll see you in a little bit.